Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Arminio. In this video, I'm going to point you toward powerful lost tools of critical thinking and speaking that your middle school, high school, or college son or daughter very much need to acquire. What are these lost tools of critical thinking and speaking that I think your son or daughter needs to acquire? Well, if I were to put it down to a word or two, what is missing is classical forensics. Now, I'm going to define my terms, and I'm going to be very careful in doing so. Before I do anything more, let me say that I'm bringing you this video without advertisement. I'm simply giving back to you. I want to see improved education, and I want to see better leadership come out of it. I think we all want to see better leadership in this country. When I use the word forensics, most of you are going to think I'm talking about Law and Order TV shows, CSI shows, talking about forensics science. The lab technician in the white coat in the back room of the detective's office who's helping crack the case with her microscope. And that's not what I mean at all. I'm talking about a different definition, a different idea of the word forensics. In fact, I'm talking about a word that has ancient roots, Greek and Roman roots to be exact. Forensics refers to the art of argumentative discourse. That's what I'm talking about. Now, when I tell you it's classical forensics, I'm trying to draw a distinction here. This is where I'm getting into now these lost tools. Because there is forensics training taking place in the United States, and a lot of good training indeed, and yet it could be doing more. And we're not talking about a great deal more effort for a tremendous, upfront effort, I should say, but in return for which tremendous benefit is reaped in the interim and the long term. I use the word conventional forensics to distinguish from what you find typically in the United States right now, where forensics training is concerned. Just differentiate that from what I'm calling classical forensics. They're the lost tools in the classical forensics. And also I'm trying to draw a sense of the history of all this, when this took place. Classical forensics, in my mind, is what the Greeks and the Romans actually intended and what they imparted to their youth with the idea of raising up leaders. About 100 years ago, there was a break, there was a discontinuity in the imparting of what I'm calling classical forensics. They wouldn't have called it classical, they just would have called it forensics back then. Well, what happened was there was a break, and for the past 100 years, we've been offering something that doesn't quite measure up to what the ancient Greeks and the Romans had in mind. And I'm calling this conventional forensics, or if you will, diluted forensics, partial forensics, trying to get across this sense that there's more that we could be done, that in a practical way, realistic way, there's more that we could be sharing with our students, and therefore better leadership could be coming out of this undertaking. Now, before we go any further about what exactly is classical forensics and what is conventional forensics for that matter, what's the state of training our youth in in critical thinking and public speaking? Well, we offer very little classical thinking training and public speaking training at all in this country. And I'm not the only one saying this. I would refer you, for example, to a very important document, a master's thesis that was written, published, I guess, in 2012. And Statesman Debate Institute thinks so highly of this document that we have provided a link to this document on the homepage of our website. You can see this master's thesis in its entirety. The author is an Ellen Sworenson. And what she has to say is very frightening. What she has to say is that classical, or I should say critical thinking technique and public speaking technique is essentially gone missing in the traditional school program, in the secondary school level. She would make up for it by offering the student what I'm calling conventional forensics. So her solution doesn't go far enough, I believe. But it's better than what they're getting, for sure. But let's take a further look at this. So in your traditional school, you're not getting critical thinking and speaking training, or you pick it up on your own, unless you take courses in advanced placement, AP History, AP Government. In these cases, in these courses, you will get some additional critical thinking technique. You will not get public speaking technique. unless the instructor wants to add that as an unusual supplement. So if you, though, go on and get yourself involved in what I'm calling conventional forensics, you will get more, thank goodness, you'll get more critical thinking technique and public speaking technique. And how do you get that? Well, you go on the vast and very popular student speech and debate circuit in this country. Everywhere you look, there's a debate club. There's some important debate resolution before students at the middle school, high school, and the college levels. There are government simulations like Model Congress, Model UN. There's a lot of forensics activity taking place in this country. And it does go way beyond what you're getting in AP courses and further beyond what you're getting in the traditional fare, the run-of-the-mill course from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. And yet still something is missing. In fact, a great deal more is missing. And this thing that's missing I'm calling classical forensics. So classical forensics includes what I'm calling conventional forensics, and it offers a bit more. In fact, more than just a bit more. A lot more. At least the impact of what it offers has a greater consequence, positive consequence. Now, I want to now give you further sense of what is classical forensics and how does it differ from conventional forensics and what are the consequences of these differences I'm going to address now in the next part of this video. It's now time to define this approach I'm calling classical forensics and to draw a distinction with conventional forensics. Let's put some meat on the bone. When I talk about classical forensics, I mean, to a large extent, classical rhetoric, especially that which was advanced by Aristotle, Cicero, and in our own country, John Quincy Adams. But more to the point, I'm talking about what I would call the mid-range of skills presented or part of classical rhetoric. The low end or the low range of skills is what I would associate with conventional forensics. The mid-range, that's what I think is more appropriate for secondary school and to some degree college. That in other words, the middle school and especially the high school student has the ability, it is a manageable thing, to acquire more of classical rhetoric than they're typically getting elsewhere, getting in conventional circles. There's another crucial element of this approach of the classical forensics, and that is Cicero's pursuit of universal knowledge, or what I would call being open to all information, accessing information, inclusive information. What we see in the conventional circles is a tendency to be exclusive. There's certain information they exclude, whether it's conscious or not, they just tend to exclude it. The upshot of classical forensics, offering the mid-range of classical rhetoric and being open to as much information as possible, results in a student who is becoming an expert in his own right on a particular topic, or at least learning what it would take to acquire such expertise, coming to his own conclusions, and expressing his conclusions in his own words for a general audience. And you'll find along the way that that student is making judicious use of the information. Yes, he's open to all types, but he's not reading everything. Now, the conventionally trained student, by contrast, is tending to rely more, I think, over-relying upon others to do his thinking for him, relying too much on third-party experts, typically think tank analysts. And he's serving up a quilt of other people's opinions or conclusions. He may or may not express it in his own words. There'll be a lot of quotations from other people that'll pepper or fill up his own remarks. And he may or may not be expressing himself for a general audience. Often, I'm afraid to say that in conventional circles, he's not even thinking about a general audience. He's involved strictly in sport or spectacle. He may be cluttering his remarks with jargon, and also he may be using a tactic called spread, where you speak as rapidly as possible to cram in as much argument and evidence as possible. It's, in a sense, it's virtually unintelligible. So there's great differences. And above all, his coach is going to tell him to read everything, as if somebody can do that. It's just not practical to read everything, but that's what he's being encouraged to do. instead of making judicious, thoughtful uses of the information. Try to read all the information. So this is the essence of classical forensics and the essence of conventional forensics. Now, beyond this, I would share with you 4 specific characteristics of classical forensics, and again show a distinction with the conventional approach. Now, one of them is the size of the toolbox. Because the classically trained is working from the mid-range of skills, as I'm defining it, they're going to have more tools at their disposal. And that means that they're better able to manage information, to craft a research plan, and to craft their own speech or argument. One of the tools that the classically trained receive that they conventionally don't receive is a tool that helps you construct the central message of a speech or an essay. It's gone missing in conventional circles. Here's a fundamental building blocks which is not imparted in conventional circles. And it has repercussions. And there are many other tools just like that that are fundamental that are not imparted. To a large degree, the conventionally trained student just left to his own devices to discover important technique or important tools. Another characteristic of the classically trained, and again the difference with the conventional, has to do with the fact that the classically trained range over more types of information. They use not just secondary sources, but also primary sources. In fact, they make a lot of use of primary sources as much as they can. They like to work with the raw data themselves. They're very untrustworthy, in a sense, very suspicious of someone else handling that raw data. They don't like to be depending upon a filter or filters of the raw data if they can help it. The conventionally trained, they're nearly exclusive in their use of secondary sources. They're in the hands of the filters of the raw data. They rarely ever work with the raw data directly. A third characteristic of the classically trained, and showing a difference with the conventional, is in the classically trained's awareness of ways of solving problems. And this also goes back to having multiple perspectives, being aware of multiple worldviews. The classically trained is aware, yes, of the conventional wisdom. So in forensic circles, we're using politics and economics as our subject matter. That means that the classically trained is aware of liberalism and conservatism, yes, and socialism and capitalism, and the mix thereof. But he's also aware, or she's also aware, that there's a non-conventional way of doing things, that there are true third ways of solving problems. That conventionally trained student knows the conventional wisdom, but doesn't know more than that. So what happens is, often the classically trained are discovering arguments that the conventional are not discovering. They're seeing parts of the world the other is not seeing, and they often have the element of surprise in tournaments, or at least early on in a tournament. A fourth difference has to do with the use of history. The classically trained make more use, and I think a more sophisticated use of history than the conventionally trained. The secondary sources have their say. The secondary source, some think tank analyst, some academic, some professor, may suggest a certain relevant chronology or narration. The classically trained will say, yes, but let me take a look at it myself. I may need to assemble my own narrative. The conventionally trained, they rely upon what the secondary source has to say. So these are 4 characteristics separating the classical from the conventional. Now let me illustrate the classical. And the first thing I would do is let's take a look at the use of primary sources. It so happened not that long ago that we were debating the merits of a universal basic income. The idea that the federal government should cut a check every month for every American citizen, regardless of their financial situation. Well, as you can imagine, at the heart of such a debate was the federal budget. What should be cut? What should be added? Can we expand the budget? Can we dare expand it in the face of the economy? The classically trained worked with the federal budget numbers themselves. They were given tools to make that work manageable and enjoyable, but they worked as much as they could with the actual numbers. Yes, they listened to what the think tank analysts had to say about the federal budget in the context of the universal basic income. But still, they wanted to work with the raw data themselves, and did. Conventionally trained, strictly relying upon the secondary sources and upon what those sources told them mattered where the budget and the universal basic income proposal are concerned. A second illustration I can give you gives you a sense of the greater wisdom that the classically trained can draw from. As I prepare this video, we're debating the Medicare for All Act of 2019. Well, the classically trained is quite aware that there's a conventional way of solving the problem, of solving the healthcare crisis. You can go the socialistic route, you can go the capitalistic route. You can mix the two to some degree. But they're also aware of a true third way that's neither socialism nor capitalism. It's called distributism. Others call it relational policy. But this true third way is known to the classically trained, not known to the conventionally trained. The conventionally trained know about the capitalistic and the socialistic solutions, and that's as far as it goes for them. Another example I would give you is in the use of history. Some years back, not that far back, there was a debate about missile defenses and Korea. Specifically resolved South Korea should be deploying missile defenses. What? To stop potential offensive missiles being fired from North Korea at them. Well, this debate, and missile defenses, by the way, are an interceptor. It's also a missile, a defensive missile, which goes up and meets the descending offensive missile. Well, this debate involved North Korea, South Korea, so two small powers, but it also involved the great powers China, friend of North Korea, and the United States, friend of South Korea. And so what happened is a great power theory made its way into this debate. And the classically trained were very much aware of this theory, but they said, well, thank you very much, but let me look at the narrative myself, at the history myself, some salient moments in the history. In particular, let me look at how the great power of the United States behaved. And lo and behold, there were differences in the way our country behaved and the way the theories said we should have behaved. The conventionally trained, they made great use of the theory, but they weren't aware of the actual behavior of the great power in question. Advantage, I think, the classically trained. And a fourth example also comes from that missile defense debate that I just referenced. Now, as part of that debate, we were looking at technologies, the missile defenses, having to operate in a series of circumstances. So here you have the factor of missile defense in various circumstances. And the circumstances, well, three especially, peacetime. They might be simply moving along as if nothing had happened, a typical day at peace, and suddenly from out of the blue, a bolt from out of the blue, the North Koreans wage war, rain down offensive missiles on South Korea. That missile defense battery has to spring to action. You have a circumstance where it's an actual wartime. War's been going on for some time. You are already ready. You're already at war. There's no surprises per se. And then you have the circumstance of a test range where you're simulating war. So you have these three circumstances. Well, the classically trained know that missile defense in various circumstances is a big factor in the debate. So what do? Well, they go off and read about it. They go find articles which will talk about one circumstance, another circumstance, and a third circumstance. But they don't necessarily read the entire article. And they certainly don't read a lot of articles. They're just trying to get enough to understand that factor in the circumstance, a second circumstance, and a third circumstance. The conventionally trained, they're running hither and yon, as they often do, almost randomly, haphazardly, in a panic, reading everything they can, every article they can. And maybe they bump into these factors, the circumstances, and maybe they don't. So here I've given you some illustrations of classical forensics, and in certain places given you a comparison to the conventional. And I've talked about the characteristics of the classical approach versus the conventional, and I've given you some sense of the essence of the classical versus the conventional. It's now time to talk about where we can find classical forensics. Where can you find classical forensics? There are several places to look. I've given you a hint about one of these places in the very title of this video. The Lost Tools of Learning was a famous speech given by Dorothy Sayers in 1947. In that speech, she urged her fellow Brits to revive and update medieval education, which in turn was based upon the Greek and the Roman way of doing things. Well, this idea of reviving classical education caught on in the United States in a very big way. And you now have homeschool families, brick and mortar institutions, online programs, all offering classical education. I would certainly think that any program based upon classical education would be open to classical forensics. But are they offering it per se, classical forensics? I wonder. But they would be open, certainly. Now, my concern is that a classically based school that wanted to involve its students in speech and debate would get caught up in the conventional forensics tide, not knowing any better. That they would end up bringing in classical forensics technique and ways of doing things when they could be going so much higher. Another possible place to find classical forensics is at the level of the debate leagues. Most debate leagues are part and parcel of the conventional forensics way of doing things. But there are a few that might be open to classical forensics per se. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of such a league is they absolutely bar a student from speaking far too rapidly, from using the tactic called spread. Now, there is one league that I know for sure is offering classical forensics. It's the American Classical Forensics League. It happens to be sponsored by Statesman Debate Institute, of which I am a part. You also find around the country certain debate programs they call traditional debate programs. I would think there'd be an openness to classical forensics in these circles too. They might be offering some aspects of classical forensics already. Now, what about debate institutions? Well, I've already implied, of course, already said that Statesman Debate Institute is offering classical forensics. Are there any other debate organizations? I don't know of them, which isn't to say they're not out there. I hope they find us. If they're there, I hope we find them. What about individual instructors? Well, here I suspect that at a college level, you might find a college instructor every now and then who is offering classical rhetoric by another name. They may be calling it communications studies. And that individual would, I think, appreciate classical forensics. Or they might actually be a classical rhetorician in their own right, and they would appreciate classical forensics. There's one more place to look, and it's not an institution per se, it's a way of conducting debate. Policy debate is the most sophisticated of all the debate formats in conventional debate circles. And I would think there would be an openness to classical forensics. But are they offering classical forensics? I don't think so. But they're certainly offering technique that goes beyond the norm. Now let me leave you with a couple of more thoughts. Classical forensics is a bridge between what most students are receiving and what they could be receiving in a classical education institution. So you may have a son or daughter in the public school system, or maybe even a private school, and you fret that they're not getting the quality of education they need. Bring them over to a classical forensics program. Whet their appetite. Maybe that student will want to move over to a classical education school. It also turns out that if you spend several years in a classical forensics program, such as what Statesman Debate Institute offers, you will find that you are acquiring a classical education in a nutshell. Well, there you have it. I've been offering you what I think is a very exciting, meaningful way of raising up tomorrow's leaders. I urge you, participate in classical forensics.